Great. The key thing to keep in mind for shipping, let me throw it into 3 general categories. Number 1, 80% of the stuff that enables people to grow food is transported internationally, whether it's equipment or fertilizer or fuel. Only 20% of food is traded internationally, but 80% you need the inputs to grow it in the first place. Number 2, roughly half of all oil is shipped on the ocean blue, typically by supertanker, along with everything that comes out of the Persian Gulf. And then number 3, safety on the waves is what allows us to have the East Asian manufacturing model, which is a fancy way of saying the manufacturing model, because roughly half of all manufactured goods are produced in East Asia, and you will get components coming from Thailand versus Indonesia versus China versus Korea versus Japan. But the key thing to remember is less than 1% of that shipping happens on land.
Wow.
Korea is in effect an island. Japan is an island. Most of the Southeast Asian countries are either islands or peninsulas, and they're ringed by mountains. So physical connections independent of maritime trade in Asia almost don't happen at all. Certainly, and the book is about how this happens on a decade's time scale, how the 2020s were always the decade that was always going to break down in. But events in just the last couple of months are speeding this up. A lot of this is probably going to be front-loaded. Well, think of what just happened in the first week of December. So the Europeans announced their plan for an oil export ban, and a lot of the details are being made up as they go on. It's a very European policy in that regard. But what it is encouraging is a split in the way we view oil from the Russian space versus the rest of the world, and the different types of crude coming out of the Russian space. So the stuff the Europeans are primarily concerned about is Urals crude that is exported west to the European space, and that can only be sold for $60 or less now, and that's affecting insurance and shipping rates and the type of vessels that go in. And we saw over the course of the last 2 years how disruptions in simply the type of vessel being available can generate supply chain snarls. So now we're doing this with energy, but there's also a crude grade that exports to the Pacific that doesn't touch the European space at all, that trades differently. We now, just in the Russian space, have 2 fundamentally different markets, not just for pricing, but for physical accessibility, for the ability to get ships and insurance to allow it to move. One of the reasons why the world has been so stable, air quotes stable, since 1945 is there's been one oil price. Now, it's modified by the length of the journey or the quality of the crude, but there's one oil price and everything is safe. The Europeans have now created a system where a lot of countries in Europe are now going to have a vested interest in interfering with Russian exports west. That's one pricing margin. That's one security paradigm. That's one insurance policy system. But then in the east, where the Europeans are not the players, it's a different crude grade at a different price point using different insurance systems by different countries. We have split the oil market now into at least 3 pieces, 2 Russian, 1 everything else, which means now countries no longer have a vested interest in making sure the oil flows everywhere all the time, because we're not all in this together anymore. This is just the beginning. We're going to see this spread throughout not just the energy sphere, but pretty much every major commodity, and we're hiving the world up into different supply systems. And that is a recipe for 1910s and 1930s style conflict and competition. Yeah, in the world before World War II, piracy, state piracy, and privateering were pretty common because almost everything that was shipped had an obvious value. The cost of shipping before the Cold War and globalization was about an order of magnitude more than it was previous. And in the pre-industrial world, it was an order of magnitude more than that. In the pre-deepwater era, it was an order of magnitude more. So interfering with shipping has always been very popular because you know that the value of the product is going to be high. It's only in the post-World War II era that the cost of shipping has dropped so much that we put everything on the way. So that's intermediate manufacturing, that's low value-added commodities, things that normally you would produce and consume locally. It used to be it was all pretty much luxury goods or something of very high value. Now it's a little bit of everything. We're kind of in this soft moment in history where everyone's holding their breath and wondering if the next time there's an incident, the U.S. is going to intervene or not, and I would argue we are not. Part of this is political. The Biden administration is the most populist administration we have ever had, more so than Trump. Basically, it feels like on trade policy, the Biden administration is going through Trump's tweets and picking them out one at a time and expanding them into position papers and putting them into policy and running a really good grammar scrubber over it. And we're basically getting the second Trump administration right now from a trade point of view. And then second, even if we wanted to intervene, this isn't the 60s or 70s. I mean, it used to be that there were no other naval powers. And so the United States with the destroyer-heavy Navy after World War II could patrol the global oceans because there wasn't a lot of competition and we had the right tools for the job. But since 19 1990, we've retooled our Navy, we've retired most of our smaller vessels, and we've concentrated naval power into our supercarrier battle groups. And if you want to knock off a country, that is the tool. But if you want to patrol the global oceans in an environment where other people have ship, you don't need the dozen supercarrier battle groups we have. You need like 800 destroyers. We only have 70. So even if we wanted to be the global policeman and patrol the waves, we no longer have the physical capacity to do it. Now, that sounds bad, and it is, but keep this in mind. The United States is the least maritime trade-dependent country in the world. Only 12% of our GDP is from trade. About half of that is NAFTA. We're not the ones who suffer if global trade breaks down. China's at the top of that list. Europe is a close second. China utterly lacks the naval capacity to project power more than about 1,000 miles from its coast, and it is completely dependent upon resource access and market access in countries that are half a world away. Now, the Chinese currently have 3 aircraft carriers floating. The first one used to be a casino. They will never claim that it is combat capable. They just bought it from Ukraine to refurbish it so they could learn how it works.
Okay.
Their second one is a clone of the one that used to be the casino. The one that used to be the casino used to be a Russian carrier. They called it the Kuzanov, by the way, and the Soviets thought it was a disaster. During Soviet times, with Soviet resources, it just kind of caught on fire from time to time.
Okay.
Anyway, so the Chinese do not claim that these two will ever be combat capable.
Okay.
They're training for their engineers more than anything else. And they do have a third one that they're going through sea trials right now. And it is a larger carrier that they actually designed themselves. But again, it's a prototype. They don't view it as anything other than a test bed. So they might get their first carrier in 2027. China technically is a larger country than the United States, but about 2/3 of its land is either too hot or too dry or too cold to be inhabitable. So 95% of the population lives on 1/3 of the land. Of that 95%, 70% lives in the North China Plain, which is an area that's not much bigger than the United States east of the Mississippi, maybe about 2/3 the size of that. So you're talking 1 billion people in one footprint. That footprint is flood prone, drought prone, and the river is actually, after 3,000 years of habitation, the river bed is above the surrounding land area, so it just flows down a dike. So if they get a heavy rain, the dike overflows and the river goes down into where people live. Yeah, so when you hear about flooding in northern China, just run. There's no fix here. The land is relatively low productivity. In the south, you've got tropics and you've got mountains, so it's difficult to have integration. Hong Kong has always been a separatist area, even before it was called Hong Kong. And then you've got mountains and jungles separating it from Southeast Asia and India, but then you've got the great wide open of the Eurasian steppe connecting it to the Russian space. And off the coast, you don't have an ocean of moat. You've got all these secondary powers, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan. And so China has never been able to penetrate out, but because they have a hard time unifying at home, others have often penetrated in. It's not the worst geography in the world. That's probably Afghanistan, but it's definitely in the bottom 10%. And it's only because the Americans unified the world into globalization that China exists as it does today, because we basically told all the countries that were preying on China to go home. Hell, we nuked Japan to underline that point. And so for the first time in Chinese history, the Han Chinese have been able to develop the way that they wanted to. And then Nixon and Mao had their summit and brought China into the globalized system to bring it away from the Russians. So I don't want to suggest that the Chinese played no role in their own success, but without the change in the strategic environment of Eisenhower and then ultimately Nixon, none of this would have ever happened.